The jar sits behind glass in a museum in Beijing. Clay cracked, roughly 9,000 years old. To most visitors, it looks like dozens of other ancient vessels scattered through the collection. Brown pottery, simple design, the kind of object that gets a polite glance before people move on to jade carvings or bronze weapons. But this jar is different. Chemical analysis of residue found inside revealed something unexpected. Rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and grapes, fermented together. The oldest confirmed alcoholic beverage ever discovered. Someone in Neolithic China mixed these ingredients deliberately, not randomly, not by accident. By the time this jar was made, fermentation was already understood, already controlled, already part of human culture. Which means the real beginning happened much earlier. Somewhere we have not yet found, perhaps somewhere we never will. The discovery of alcohol was almost certainly an accident. Fruit falls from trees, it sits in the sun. Wild yeasts, floating invisibly through the air, land on the skin. They begin to eat the sugars inside. Days pass. The fruit softens, splits open. Liquid pools at the bottom of whatever natural container holds it. A hollow log, a depression in rock, an abandoned gourd. Welcome to the Sleepy Documentarian. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? I'm guessing you've had a long day. Maybe you're already under the covers, phone propped against a pillow, eyes getting heavy. Or you're doing something quiet, folding laundry, washing dishes, just wanting something gentle to fill the silence. Either way, you're in the right place. An early human, perhaps 10 million years ago, perhaps more recently, perhaps dozens of times across different continents, tastes this liquid. It is sweet at first, then strange. It burns slightly going down. The taste is unlike anything from fresh fruit or clean water. And then, minutes later, something shifts. The world becomes softer. Anxiety that had been constant, the low hum of predator awareness, the tension of tribal hierarchy, the fear that is simply part of being a small, vulnerable primate, begins to dissolve. Laughter comes easier. The person feels warm, confident, less alone. This moment, whenever and wherever it happened, changed everything. Dr. Patrick McGovern, an archaeologist who has spent decades studying ancient fermentation, calls alcohol the universal drug. Unlike most psychoactive substances, which grow only in specific regions and require specialized knowledge to prepare, alcohol appears spontaneously wherever sugars and yeasts meet. Honey ferments, fruit ferments. Grain, if dampened and left alone, ferments. The raw materials exist on every inhabited continent. The process requires no teacher, no shaman, no secret technique. Nature performs it constantly, indifferently, wherever the conditions align. Our ancestors did not invent fermentation, they discovered it. And once discovered, they could not forget it. The temple at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey predates pottery, writing, and metal tools. It was built roughly 11,500 years ago by people who were not yet fully settled, not yet farming in the way we understand the term. They carved massive limestone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, and arranged them in circles. They decorated these stones with animals, snakes, foxes, wild boars, scorpions, rendered with an artistic sophistication that still startles archaeologists. And they brewed beer. Chemical traces found in stone vessels at the site confirm it. Large-scale brewing. Not a few jars for a family, but production on a scale that suggests feasting, ritual, gathering. The people who built Göbekli Tepe came from miles around, perhaps hundreds of miles, hauling stone and carving images and brewing enormous quantities of fermented grain. Then they drank together. Some archaeologists now believe that alcohol did not follow agriculture. It may have caused it. The traditional story goes like this. Humans learned to farm, settled down, produced surplus grain, and eventually someone figured out how to ferment that surplus into beer. But the evidence from Göbekli Tepe and similar sites suggests the sequence might have been reversed. People wanted beer badly enough that they began cultivating the grains necessary to make it. Farming, in this version, started not to make bread, but to make beer. Civilization built on the desire to get drunk together. The earliest written recipes we have are not for food, they are for beer. A Sumerian tablet from roughly 3,900 years ago contains the hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing. It is both prayer and instruction manual, a religious text that doubles as a step-by-step guide to fermentation. The poem describes soaking barley, forming it into bapir, a kind of twice-baked bread used as a fermentation starter, mixing it with honey and dates, and letting the mixture transform. Ninkasi, you are the one who pours out the filtered beer of the collector vat. It is like the onrush of Tigris and Euphrates. The metaphor is precise. Beer, like the rivers that made Sumerian agriculture possible, was life-giving, sacred, essential. The Sumerians paid workers in beer rations. Different occupations received different amounts. Laborers got 2 liters a day, administrators got 5. Beer was currency, nutrition, medicine, and sacrament all at once. And it was made almost entirely by women. Brewing in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and most early civilizations was women's work. It happened in homes, in temple complexes run by priestesses, in workshops where women controlled every stage of production. Ninkasi was female. Hathor, the Egyptian goddess associated with beer, was female. The Sumerian tavern keepers, the ones who sold beer and regulated drinking establishments, were women operating under their own legal authority. This was not symbolic, this was economic power. A woman who knew how to brew controlled a valuable commodity. She could sell it, trade it, use it to build networks and alliances. The alewife appears throughout ancient law codes, business records, and mythology, a figure of independence, sometimes respect, sometimes suspicion. The Code of Hammurabi includes multiple laws regulating tavern keepers, almost all of whom are referred to as female. If a tavern keeper watered down beer or overcharged, the punishment was severe. If she allowed criminals to gather in her establishment without reporting them, she could be executed. The message was clear. Women who controlled alcohol held power that authorities found both necessary and threatening. But what was it about alcohol that made it so central, so quickly, to human social life? Why did it appear in temples before it appeared in taverns? Why did people go to such lengths, planting crops, building structures, organizing labor, just to produce something that made them dizzy and impaired their judgment? The answer lies not in the drink itself, but in what happens when people consume it together. Dr. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary anthropologist at Oxford, has spent years studying the social brain. His research asks a simple question. How do humans maintain relationships with so many people? Most primates live in small groups, a dozen, maybe 24 individuals. They maintain social bonds through grooming, physical touch, systematic and time-consuming. A chimpanzee troop spends roughly 20% of its waking hours grooming each other. It is how they establish trust, reduce conflict, and signal alliance. Humans live in much larger groups. Hunter-gatherer bands typically number around 150 people, now called Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit of stable social relationships one person can maintain. But we cannot spend 20% of our time physically grooming 150 people. The math does not work. So we evolved other methods, language primarily, storytelling, laughter, music, and, Dunbar argues, intoxication. Alcohol affects the brain in ways that mimic social bonding. It increases endorphin release, The same neurochemical triggered by grooming, by laughter, by synchronized dancing or singing. It lowers social anxiety by dampening the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear and threat detection. It makes strangers feel less dangerous. It makes cooperation feel natural. In controlled studies, Dunbar's team found that people who drank moderate amounts of alcohol in social settings laughed more, made more eye contact, and shared more personal information than sober control groups. The effect was not merely about losing inhibition. It was about building what Dunbar calls social capital, the invisible network of trust and reciprocity that allows large human groups to function. Drinking together, in other words, is not just about the drink. It is about the together. This explains something that puzzled earlier researchers. Alcohol is, objectively, a poison. Ethanol is toxic. It damages the liver, the brain, the cardiovascular system. It impairs judgment, slows reaction time, and leads to behavior that, in evolutionary terms, should be catastrophically disadvantageous. A drunk human is vulnerable to predators, to accidents, to making terrible decisions about mates, resources, and alliances. And yet every human culture that has had access to fermentable materials has developed alcohol. The few exceptions, some Arctic populations, some groups in the Pacific, lived in environments where fermentation was difficult or impossible. But wherever it could be done, it was done, enthusiastically, repeatedly, with increasing sophistication. The benefits, apparently, outweighed the costs. Not for the individual necessarily, but for the group. Imagine two neighboring tribes in the Neolithic period. One has discovered beer. They gather regularly to drink, to sing, to tell stories. During these sessions, they laugh together, they make plans, they resolve disputes that might otherwise escalate to violence. They bond across kinship lines, creating networks of cooperation that extend beyond immediate family. The other tribe has no alcohol. Their social cohesion depends entirely on kinship bonds and face-to-face grooming relationships. They are more careful, more sober, more individually cautious. Which tribe survives? The anthropological evidence suggests the first one. The tribe that drinks together can coordinate more people, maintain larger alliances, and outcompete smaller, more fragmented groups. The cost: some individuals drink too much, make bad decisions, suffer health consequences, is borne by those individuals. The benefit is collective. This is the dark genius of alcohol. It works on group selection, not individual selection. It is a social technology that sacrifices some for the advantage of many. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If alcohol exists primarily to facilitate group bonding, what happens when the group disappears? What happens when someone drinks alone? The room is small, deliberately intimate. Couches line the walls. Low tables hold cups, bowls, and jugs. Outside, Athens hums with commerce, politics, and noise. Inside, perhaps a dozen men recline, eating, talking, drinking wine mixed with water in precise ratios. This is the symposium. Not a lecture or a conference, but the defining social institution of ancient Greek elite culture. A space where philosophy was debated, poetry was performed, political alliances were forged, and young men were educated in the art of civilized drinking. The rules were specific. Wine was never drunk pure. That was considered barbaric, the behavior of Scythians and other foreigners who did not understand refinement. Instead, wine was mixed with water in ratios that were announced at the beginning of the gathering. 3 parts water to 1 part wine was common. 2 to 1 if the host wanted a livelier evening. 1 to 1 was daring, possibly reckless. A symposiarch was chosen, a master of ceremonies who controlled the pace, the conversation, the mixing ratios. His job was to ensure that everyone became pleasantly intoxicated, but no one became sloppy or aggressive. The goal was not oblivion. It was a specific, cultivated state of mind the Greeks called euphrosine. a kind of joyful, expansive openness that made philosophical discussion possible and social bonds stronger. Plato wrote about symposia, so did Xenophon. The dialogues that defined Western philosophy often took place in these drinking rooms between men whose inhibitions had been carefully, deliberately lowered to exactly the right degree. But this required structure, it required ritual, it required, above all, other people. The Greeks understood something modern culture often forgets. Alcohol is a social drug that becomes dangerous when used alone. Drinking in Greek culture was almost never solitary. It happened at symposia, at festivals, at religious ceremonies. It was embedded in contexts that provided structure, meaning, and social accountability. To drink alone was seen as pathological, a sign of something broken in a person's relationship to their community. The Romans inherited this understanding but began to lose it. By the late imperial period, solitary drinking had become more common, especially among the elite. Wine was cheap, available, and socially acceptable at all hours. The checks that had existed in earlier cultures, ritual context, social oversight, limited supply, began to erode. Writers started to notice. Seneca, in his letters, warned about the man who drinks alone in the morning. Pliny the Elder described alcoholism as a disease, using language that sounds strikingly modern. The symptoms he listed, inability to stop, drinking to avoid withdrawal, neglect of responsibilities, are nearly identical to contemporary diagnostic criteria. What changed? The context collapsed. Alcohol moved from being a communal sacrament to being a private commodity. The more available it became, the less it was regulated by social ritual. The individual was left to manage a substance designed by evolution to dissolve individual caution in favor of group cohesion. This is the paradox at the heart of drinking culture. Alcohol works best when it is social, but it is most dangerous when the social structure disappears and the individual is left alone with the bottle. Throughout history, different cultures have tried to manage this paradox through ritual. The Jewish Sabbath dinner begins with blessings. The candles are lit, the challah is broken, and the kiddush is recited over a cup of wine. Wine, in Jewish tradition, is required for certain religious observances. It is not optional. It is not frowned upon. It is commanded. The Talmud includes extensive discussions about wine, how to make it, when to drink it, how much is appropriate. 4 cups are mandated at the Passover Seder. Each has symbolic meaning. Each is drunk communally at specific moments, embedded in a narrative that takes hours to complete. And yet, Jewish communities historically have had much lower rates of alcoholism than surrounding populations. Researchers studying this phenomenon initially called it the Jewish paradox. How could a culture that integrated alcohol so thoroughly into religious and family life avoid the addiction rates seen in cultures where alcohol was either forbidden or unregulated? The answer, it turns out, is not complicated. Context. Jewish drinking happens primarily in family settings, during rituals that have been performed the same way for millennia. Children see adults drinking, but they also see adults stopping. They see wine treated as sacred, not as an escape. They learn that alcohol has a place and a purpose. It enhances the joy of the Sabbath. It marks transitions. It connects the present to ancestral tradition. But it is not pursued for its own sake. The drinking is embedded. Compare this to cultures where alcohol is either forbidden or completely unregulated. In communities where alcohol is banned, whether by religion, law, or social pressure, the individuals who do drink often do so in secret, without oversight, without the gradual socialization that teaches limits. The message is binary. Alcohol is either completely forbidden or, if you are going to break the rule, you might as well go all the way. In communities where alcohol is unregulated, where it is advertised as glamorous, available everywhere, and divorced from any larger meaning, the social structures that once contained its use collapse. You can drink alone, at any hour, for any reason. There is no symposiarch. There is no Sabbath dinner. There is no ritual that says, this far but no further. Other cultures have developed their own containing rituals. In Japan, drinking with co-workers after work, nomikai, serves a specific social function. It allows employees to speak more freely to superiors, to air grievances that would be impossible in the sober hierarchy of the office. The alcohol provides cover. What is said during nomikai is understood to exist in a separate space, governed by different rules. The next morning, everyone returns to their formal roles, and the previous night's candor is quietly forgotten. But even here, structure contains the chaos. You drink with your group. You drink after work, not during it. You drink until a certain hour, and then everyone goes home together. The ritual defines the boundaries. Among some indigenous cultures in the Americas, alcohol was historically unknown. When it was introduced by European colonizers, it arrived without any of the cultural rituals that had evolved elsewhere to manage it. The result was catastrophic. Addiction rates soared. Communities that had stable social structures for thousands of years fractured within a few generations. This was not because indigenous people had some biological vulnerability. It was because the substance arrived without the context. The rituals that might have contained it, the rules about when, where, how much, and with whom, did not exist. And in the chaos of colonization, displacement, and cultural destruction, there was no time or stability to develop them. The lesson is consistent across cultures. Alcohol becomes dangerous when it escapes ritual. When the structure collapses, when the social context vanishes, when the individual is left alone to negotiate with a drug designed to dissolve individual judgment, addiction becomes epidemic. And that is exactly what happened in Europe during the 18th century. London, 1751. William Hogarth publishes two prints that will become iconic images of alcohol's dual nature. The first, Beer Street, shows a prosperous, orderly neighborhood. Workers are healthy, well-fed, and productive. A man reads a book. Women laugh. Buildings are maintained. Beer, the print suggests, builds civilization. The second print, Gin Lane, depicts hell. A mother, too drunk to notice, drops her baby over a railing. A man gnaws on a bone beside a skeletal dog. Buildings collapse in the background. An undertaker's shop thrives. In the foreground, a woman pours gin down her throat while her emaciated child reaches for her, ignored. This was not exaggeration, it was reportage. Between 1720 and 1750, London experienced what historians now call the gin craze, the first documented epidemic of mass addiction in European history. At its peak, 1 in 4 houses in some London neighbourhoods sold gin. Annual consumption reached roughly 10 litres of pure alcohol per person, including children. That is roughly double the consumption rate in modern Britain, which is itself considered concerningly high. What happened? The answer is economic, political, and chemical all at once. In 1689, the British government, eager to weaken French brandy imports, passed laws encouraging domestic spirits production. Grain surpluses, which would ordinarily go to waste or be sold cheaply as animal feed, could now be distilled into gin. No license was required. No regulation existed. Anyone with a still could set up shop. Gin was cheap, staggeringly cheap. For a penny, a labourer could get drunk. For 2 pennies, dead drunk. The slogan appeared in gin shop windows. Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pennies, clean straw for nothing. The straw was for passing out on. The spirit itself was harsh, poorly distilled, often contaminated with turpentine or sulfuric acid to add flavor, sometimes deliberately adulterated to increase potency. It burned going down. It caused immediate, powerful intoxication. And it was available everywhere, all the time, to anyone. The social structures that had historically contained alcohol, guilds, churches, family oversight, expensive production, collapsed. Gin required no feast day, no ritual, no community. It was private, instant, and obliterating. The consequences were catastrophic. Death rates in London exceeded birth rates. Infant mortality soared, both from mothers drinking during pregnancy and from neglect after birth. Crime increased. Productivity collapsed. Entire neighborhoods descended into what contemporaries described as animalistic chaos. The government, alarmed, passed the Gin Acts starting in 1736. Taxes were raised. Licenses were required. Enforcement was brutal. Informants who reported illegal gin sellers received rewards. Riots broke out when authorities tried to shut down gin shops in poor neighborhoods. It took decades, but eventually the epidemic subsided. Not because people stopped wanting gin, but because the price increased, regulation returned, and alternative forms of alcohol, beer, ale, became cheaper and more socially acceptable again. The gin craze revealed something that would be rediscovered repeatedly over the next 3 centuries. Distillation changes everything. For most of human history, alcohol was weak. Beer was typically 2 to 4% alcohol by volume. Wine ranged from 8 to 12%. Mead, depending on how it was made, fell somewhere in between. These drinks were intoxicating, but slowly. You could feel yourself getting drunk. You had time to stop. Distillation, which emerged in the Islamic world during the 8th and 9th centuries and spread to Europe by the 12th century, changed the equation. By heating fermented liquid and collecting the vapor, which contained a higher concentration of alcohol than the original liquid, alchemists could produce spirits with 40%, 50%, even 60% alcohol. The word alcohol itself comes from Arabic, alcohol, originally referring to a fine powder used as eye makeup, later extended to mean any refined substance, and eventually applied specifically to distilled spirits. Early European distillers believed they had discovered something magical. They called it aqua vitae, water of life. They thought it had medicinal properties, that it could cure disease, restore youth, even grant immortality. The name persists in modern spirits. Whiskey comes from the Gaelic Uisce Beatha, also meaning water of life. But distilled spirits are not medicine. They are concentrated poison. Ethanol is toxic at high concentrations. The body can metabolize it, but slowly, at a rate of roughly 1 standard drink per hour. If you drink faster than your liver can process the alcohol, the concentration in your bloodstream rises. At 0.08% blood alcohol content, BAC, judgment and coordination are noticeably impaired. At 0.15%, most people experience significant motor control loss. At 0.30%, unconsciousness is likely. At 0.40%, death becomes possible. Distilled spirits deliver high concentrations of alcohol rapidly. A shot of whiskey contains the same amount of alcohol as a full beer, but it reaches the bloodstream much faster. The drinker can bypass the natural warning signs, fullness, nausea, gradual intoxication, that weaker drinks provide. By the time the body realizes it is in danger, it may be too late. This explains why distilled spirits, throughout history, have been associated with more severe addiction and social problems than beer or wine. It is not that the alcohol is chemically different. It is that the delivery mechanism bypasses the body's protective mechanisms. And yet, Distilled spirits became central to global trade, to colonization, to the economies of entire nations. Why? Because they traveled. Beer spoils. Wine, if not stored properly, turns to vinegar. Mead ferments unpredictably during transport. For most of human history, alcohol was local. It was made where it was consumed. It tied people to specific places, specific climates, specific crops. Distilled spirits changed this. High alcohol content acts as a preservative. Rum, whiskey, gin, these could survive months in the hold of a ship, crossing oceans, enduring heat and storms. They could be produced in one place and consumed in another, thousands of miles away. This made them ideal for trade and for control. The Atlantic slave trade ran on rum. Distilleries in New England and the Caribbean turned molasses, a byproduct of sugar production, into rum. That rum was shipped to West Africa, where it was traded for enslaved people. Those people were transported to the Caribbean and the American South, where they were forced to work on sugar plantations. The sugar was sent north, turned into molasses and rum, and the cycle repeated. Alcohol was not incidental to this system. It was central. African traders demanded rum, textiles, and firearms. Of these, rum was often the most valuable. European traders watered it down, adulterated it, and sold it at enormous markup. The demand was insatiable. Why? Because alcohol had been introduced to West African societies without the cultural rituals that had evolved elsewhere to contain it. It arrived as a commodity, divorced from ceremony, kinship, or religion. It was intoxicating, relatively cheap, and increasingly necessary to participate in trade networks that had become essential for survival. A similar pattern appeared everywhere distilled spirits reached. In North America, fur traders used whiskey to establish relationships with indigenous peoples. Colonial administrators in Australia used rum as currency, paying soldiers and settlers in spirits when coin was scarce. In India, the British colonial government established a state monopoly on alcohol production, taxing it heavily and using the revenue to fund the administration. In each case, alcohol served as both economic tool and instrument of control. It generated profit. It created dependence. It disrupted existing social structures that might have resisted colonial authority. And it introduced addiction on a scale that had never been seen before. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the father of American psychiatry, published a pamphlet in 1784 that would change how alcohol was understood. It was titled, An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Body and Mind. Rush argued that habitual drunkenness was not a moral failing. It was a disease. This was radical. For centuries, excessive drinking had been seen as a sin, a weakness of character, a failure of willpower. Drunkards were punished, shamed, and excluded from respectable society. The assumption was that they chose to drink, and therefore they could choose to stop. Rush disagreed. He observed that some people, once they started drinking, could not stop. They craved alcohol even when it destroyed their health, their relationships, and their livelihoods. They suffered physical symptoms when they tried to quit: tremors, sweating, hallucinations. This, Rush argued, was not choice. It was compulsion, driven by changes in the body itself. He was not the first to notice this, but he was among the first to argue that medicine, not morality, should address it. His ideas spread slowly. The temperance movement, which began in the early 19th century, initially focused on moderation rather than abstinence. The goal was to reduce consumption of distilled spirits while encouraging beer and wine, which were seen as less dangerous. But as the movement grew, it radicalized. By the mid-1800s, many temperance advocates were calling for total prohibition. They had seen too many families destroyed, too many children neglected, Too many workers impoverished by alcohol. They believed the only solution was to eliminate the substance entirely. What they did not fully understand was that alcohol was not just a commodity. It was a social technology that had been woven into human culture for millennia. Removing it without addressing the needs it fulfilled would create a vacuum. That vacuum would be filled by something worse. January 17th, 1920. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution takes effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors is now illegal. The temperance movement had finally won. After decades of organizing, lobbying, and campaigning, they had achieved what once seemed impossible. America would be dry. The results were catastrophic. Prohibition did reduce alcohol consumption, at least initially. Death rates from cirrhosis and alcohol-related diseases declined. Some communities reported fewer domestic violence incidents and less public drunkenness. But the law created a black market almost immediately. Within months, illegal bars, speakeasies, opened across the country. Criminal organizations, which had previously been small-time operations, suddenly had access to enormous revenue streams. Making, smuggling, and selling alcohol became one of the most profitable illegal enterprises in American history. The alcohol itself became more dangerous. Without regulation, bootleggers produced spirits with no quality control. Some batches were contaminated with methanol, a toxic alcohol that causes blindness and death. Others were adulterated with industrial chemicals. In 1926 alone, an estimated 50,000 people were poisoned by contaminated alcohol. Thousands died. And the drinking became less social. Speakeasies were hidden, often in basements or back rooms. There was no symposiarch, no Sabbath dinner, no ritual to contain the consumption. People drank quickly, before the police arrived. They drank whatever was available, regardless of quality. The careful, gradual intoxication of earlier drinking cultures was replaced by rapid, desperate consumption of whatever could be obtained. Women, interestingly, began drinking in much larger numbers during Prohibition. Before the 18th Amendment, most bars and saloons were male spaces. Women who drank publicly were seen as morally suspect. But speakeasies, because they were illegal anyway, welcomed everyone. For the first time, middle-class women could drink in mixed company without destroying their reputations. The cultural shift was profound. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, drinking had been normalized in ways that would have been unthinkable in 1920. Alcohol had become associated with rebellion, sophistication, and modernity. The temperance movement's attempt to eliminate drinking had instead transformed it into something glamorous and defiant. The lesson was clear. Prohibition does not work if the underlying demand remains. People do not drink only because alcohol is available. They drink because it fulfills social and psychological needs. Remove the legal supply, and a legal supply emerges. Remove the social structures that contain use, and addiction increases. But what exactly are those needs? Why do people keep returning to a substance that causes so much harm? Dr. George Koob stands in his laboratory at the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, pointing to brain scans on a monitor. The images show the same person's brain before and after years of heavy drinking. The differences are striking. This, he says, tapping the first image, is normal dopamine response. And this, he taps the second, is what we call reward deficit syndrome. The healthy brain lights up brightly in the reward centers, the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, when the person experiences something pleasurable: food, sex, social connection, achievement. These activities trigger dopamine release, the neurochemical that signals, "This is good, do this again." The second brain barely flickers. Years of alcohol exposure have numbed the reward system. The brain has adapted to artificial stimulation by reducing its natural dopamine production and downregulating receptors. Now, normal pleasures, a good meal, a conversation with friends, a walk in the park, produce almost no reward signal. But alcohol still works. Barely, and requiring ever-increasing doses, but it still works. This is the trap. Koob explains that addiction is not primarily about the pleasure of using. It is about the pain of not using. In the early stages, people drink because it feels good. The euphoria, the social ease, the relief from anxiety. But over time, the brain adjusts. Tolerance develops. The same amount produces less effect. And between drinks, something new emerges. Withdrawal. Not just physical symptoms like tremors and sweating, but a profound psychological discomfort. Anxiety, irritability, anhedonia. The inability to feel pleasure from anything except the drug. The person is no longer drinking to feel good. They are drinking to feel normal. This is why telling an alcoholic to just stop is like telling a drowning person to just breathe. The neurobiology has shifted. What began as a choice has become a compulsion. But here is what makes alcohol different from many other addictive drugs. It retains its social component even after addiction develops. A heroin addict typically isolates. A gambling addict sits alone at a machine. But alcoholics often drink in bars, at parties, with friends, even as their relationship to alcohol becomes pathological. This social mask makes the disease harder to identify and harder to treat. The person is still showing up to work, still attending family dinners, still laughing with friends. The drinking is visible, but it is camouflaged by social drinking around them. And society sends mixed messages. The commercial begins with slow-motion footage of beautiful people laughing on a beach. The sun is setting. The ocean glitters. A bottle of vodka appears, frosted with condensation. A deep voice speaks. Escape. You've earned it. The camera lingers on the bottle. The people toast. They drink. They are impossibly attractive, impossibly happy, impossibly free. What the commercial does not show, the same bottle, weeks later, empty on a coffee table at 3 a.m. A person drinking alone. The shaking hands, the regret. Alcohol is one of the most heavily marketed products in the world. In the United States alone, the alcohol industry spends roughly $2 billion annually on advertising. The ads associate drinking with success, sophistication, masculinity, femininity, celebration, relaxation. Every positive emotion and aspiration human beings have. What they do not mention is addiction, or liver disease, or the roughly 95,000 Americans who die from alcohol-related causes each year, or the families destroyed, the careers ended, the potential never realized because someone crossed the invisible line from social drinking to dependency and could not find their way back. The industry argues, correctly, that most people who drink do so responsibly. Roughly 90% of people who consume alcohol never develop a problem. For them, it remains what it has been throughout most of history. A social lubricant, a way to relax, a pleasant part of celebrations and gatherings. But for the other 10%, alcohol is a slow-motion catastrophe. And that 10% is not randomly distributed. Certain factors increase vulnerability. Genetics. Children of alcoholics are 4 times more likely to develop addiction themselves. Trauma, mental health conditions, early exposure, social isolation, and cultural context. The industry knows this. Internal documents from alcohol companies, revealed through lawsuits and investigations, show sophisticated understanding of who their heavy consumers are. A small percentage of drinkers account for the majority of alcohol sales. A 2013 study found that the top 10% of American drinkers consumed an average of 10 drinks per day. Every day. These are not people celebrating occasionally. These are people in crisis, and they are extraordinarily profitable. This creates a moral paradox for the alcohol industry. They cannot publicly market to alcoholics. That would be monstrous and illegal. But they also cannot afford to lose the heavy consumers who generate most of their revenue. So they market lifestyle, freedom, celebration, knowing that the people most likely to see those ads and feel compelled by them are often the people most vulnerable to addiction. Critics call this predatory. Defenders call it capitalism. Both are right. Dr. Sarah Wakeman sits across from a patient in her office at Massachusetts General Hospital. The patient is in his early 40s, well-dressed, employed, articulate. He came in complaining of fatigue and stomach problems. The blood tests revealed what he had not mentioned: severe liver damage. "How much are you drinking?" Dr. Wakeman asks gently. "A couple drinks after work," he says, "to unwind. Maybe a little more on weekends." She has heard this before. A couple often means 5 or 6. A little more often means blackout drinking. The gap between what people report and what they actually consume can be enormous, not always because they are lying, but because they genuinely do not know. They have lost track. The boundaries have blurred. Alcohol use disorder, the clinical term that has replaced alcoholism, exists on a spectrum. At one end, people who occasionally drink too much and regret it the next day. At the other end, people whose lives have been completely destroyed by alcohol, who suffer life-threatening withdrawal if they try to stop, who have lost jobs, relationships, and health. Most people with alcohol use disorder fall somewhere in between. They are functional until suddenly they are not. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed how fragile that functionality can be. When lockdowns eliminated social structures, no more after-work drinks with colleagues, no more dinner parties, no more bars where drinking happened in public view, many people suddenly found themselves drinking alone, at home, at all hours, with no one watching. Alcohol sales increased by 14% in the first year of the pandemic. Emergency room visits for alcohol-related issues surged. Deaths from alcoholic liver disease, which had been declining, reversed course dramatically. The social rituals that had contained drinking, the symposium, the Sabbath dinner, the nomikai, had eroded gradually over decades. The pandemic removed what remained, and people discovered, often to their horror, that without external structure, they could not stop. This is the crisis modern society faces. Alcohol is more available, more socially acceptable, and more heavily marketed than ever before. But the social structures that historically contained its use have largely collapsed. We are left with an ancient drug, one that has been intertwined with human culture for 10,000 years, but without the cultural context that made it manageable. We have the symposium's wine, but not the symposiarch. We have the ritual object, but not the ritual. And so we improvise. The meeting room in the church basement is fluorescent bright and slightly cold. Folding chairs form a circle. A coffee urn gurgles in the corner. 12 people sit, some nervously, some with the ease of long practice. "My name is James," a man says, "and I'm an alcoholic." "Hi, James," the group responds in unison. Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935 by 2 men who could not stop drinking and discovered that talking to each other helped, has become one of the most widespread responses to alcohol addiction. Millions of people have passed through AA meetings. For many, it has saved their lives. The program is not medical, it is spiritual and communal. The famous 12 steps involve admitting powerlessness, seeking help from a higher power, making amends, and helping others. The meetings provide structure, accountability, and something that modern life often lacks: genuine community. AA meetings are, in a sense, a new ritual. They happen at regular times in specific places, following a predictable format. They create what the symposium created: a space where people gather, share honestly, and hold each other accountable. The intoxicant is gone, but the need for connection remains. Critics point out that AA's success rate is difficult to measure and probably lower than the organization claims. The program works brilliantly for some people and not at all for others. Its emphasis on powerlessness and a higher power alienates those who see addiction as a medical condition requiring medical treatment, not spiritual surrender. But even critics acknowledge that AA has helped millions, and it has done so by recreating something ancient: ritual community. Other approaches have emerged. Medication-assisted treatment uses drugs like naltrexone to reduce cravings and block the euphoric effects of alcohol. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps people identify triggers and develop coping mechanisms. Harm reduction strategies accept that not everyone will or can achieve complete abstinence and focus instead on reducing consumption and its associated harms. What all successful approaches have in common is this: they provide structure. They replace the rituals that have been lost. Some people find that structure in AA meetings. Others find it in therapy appointments, in medication schedules, in new hobbies and relationships that do not involve alcohol. Some find it in cultures that still maintain older drinking rituals, returning to religious communities, embracing ethnic traditions, deliberately creating boundaries around when and how alcohol is consumed. And increasingly, some find it by not drinking at all. The bar in Brooklyn does not serve alcohol. It looks like every other trendy cocktail lounge: dim lighting, velvet booths, carefully curated music. But the menu lists elaborate mocktails made with botanical extracts, house-made syrups, and premium non-alcoholic spirits. The crowd on a Friday night is young, dressed fashionably, laughing and talking. To an outside observer, it looks identical to any other bar. Except no one is getting drunk. This is the sober curious movement, a growing trend especially among millennials and Gen Z, who are drinking significantly less than previous generations. The reasons vary. Some have personal or family history with addiction and want to avoid the risk. Some are focused on health and fitness. Some simply do not like how alcohol makes them feel. But many describe something deeper: a sense that the promised social benefits of drinking are overrated. "I used to think I needed alcohol to be interesting," says Maya, a 28-year-old graphic designer. "Then I realized I was more interesting without it. I could actually remember conversations. I could have deep connections with people instead of just loud, superficial ones. And I didn't feel like garbage the next day." This generational shift is striking. Alcohol consumption among young adults has been declining steadily since the early 2000s. The peak years, when young people drank the most, have shifted later in life, and a significant minority are choosing not to drink at all, not for religious or medical reasons, but simply because they do not see the point. This would have been unthinkable even 30 years ago. For previous generations, especially in Western cultures, social life was almost synonymous with drinking. Bars, parties, celebrations. Alcohol was assumed. Choosing not to drink marked you as other, religious, sick, pregnant, or simply boring. That stigma is fading. Non-alcoholic beers and spirits have improved dramatically. Sober bars and alcohol-free events are becoming common in major cities. Social media has made it easier to find communities of non-drinkers. Some researchers believe this represents a fundamental shift in how younger generations think about intoxication. They have grown up with abundant documentation of drunken behavior, photos and videos posted online, permanent and searchable. They have seen the costs more clearly than previous generations, and they have more entertainment options that do not involve bars. But others worry. If alcohol is declining, what is replacing it? Cannabis use is increasing. So is use of ADHD medications, anxiety medications, and a proliferating array of nootropics and supplements that promise to enhance focus, reduce stress, or optimize performance. The need to alter consciousness, to ease social anxiety, to create space for connection. These have not disappeared. They are simply finding new expressions. The wedding reception is in full swing. Champagne flows. Toasts are made. Strangers become friends on the dance floor. Laughter rises in waves. An uncle tells a story he has told before, but somehow tonight it is funnier. A cousin who has not spoken to another cousin in years pulls her aside and they cry and reconcile. The bride's father, who spent weeks anxious about his speech, delivers it flawlessly, moved by emotion and perhaps half a bottle of wine. This is alcohol at its best. This is what it was designed for, evolutionarily speaking. Creating the conditions for human connection, reducing social friction, allowing people to be vulnerable and silly and honest in ways that sobriety often prevents. And the truth is, it works. Not for everyone, not all the time, not without costs. But for many people, in the right contexts, alcohol still performs its ancient function. It makes gatherings warmer. It makes strangers less frightening. It creates memories that would not exist without it. This is why alcohol persists, despite everything we know about its dangers. Because the benefits are real. Because human beings need connection, and alcohol facilitates connection in ways that few other things can. The question is not whether these benefits exist. The question is whether the benefits justify the costs. For some people, the answer is clearly yes. They drink moderately, in social settings, with people they trust. They enjoy the effects. They suffer no significant consequences. They are the 90% for whom alcohol is exactly what it appears to be. A pleasant addition to life, not a source of destruction. For others, the answer is clearly no. The costs, addiction, health problems, damaged relationships, wasted potential, far outweigh any benefits. For them, any amount of alcohol is too much. And for many people, the answer shifts over time. Drinking that was once social and controlled becomes solitary and compulsive. The boundaries that once existed erode. The ritual that once contained the chaos collapses. This is the tragedy of alcohol. It works until it doesn't. And often, by the time someone realizes it has stopped working, the damage is already severe. Dr. David Nutt, a neuropsychopharmacologist in London, believes he has created the future of alcohol. It is called alkosynth, a synthetic compound that mimics alcohol's pleasant effects on the brain without the toxicity, the hangovers, or the addiction potential. In theory, alkosynth targets only the GABA-A receptors that produce relaxation and social ease. It does not affect the liver. It does not impair cognition as severely as ethanol. And crucially, it has a built-in ceiling effect. After a certain dose, taking more produces no additional intoxication. You cannot black out on alkosynth. You cannot overdose. Nutt argues that replacing ethanol with safer synthetic alternatives could save millions of lives. Alcohol is responsible for roughly 3 million deaths globally each year. It is the 7th leading risk factor for premature death and disability. If we could produce the social benefits of drinking without the medical catastrophes, why wouldn't we? Critics raise numerous objections. We do not know the long-term effects of these synthetic compounds. The industry will never adopt them voluntarily. They would lose their most profitable customers. And philosophically, there is something unsettling about engineering away the risks while keeping the effects. Isn't the danger part of what makes the ritual meaningful? But Nuts Project reflects a larger question. If we understand that alcohol fulfills genuine human needs, for connection, for reduced anxiety, for altered consciousness, can we find better ways to meet those needs? Some point to psychedelics, which are experiencing a renaissance in research. Studies suggest that psilocybin, MDMA, and other compounds used in therapeutic settings can produce profound experiences of connection and reduce symptoms of depression, PTSD, and addiction. Unlike alcohol, they are not physically addictive. Unlike alcohol, they do not produce daily cravings or require escalating doses. But they also do not fit easily into social drinking culture. You cannot casually take psilocybin at a wedding reception. The experiences are intense, often overwhelming, and require preparation and integration. They are tools for healing, not social lubrication. Others argue that the solution is not pharmacological at all. The problem is not that alcohol is dangerous. The problem is that we have lost the social structures that made it safe. The answer is not new drugs, but old rituals. Rebuild community. Create meaningful gatherings that do not center on consumption. Teach people how to be vulnerable and connect without chemical assistance. This is easier said than done in a culture that is increasingly atomized, where loneliness is epidemic, where many people go days without meaningful face-to-face conversation. The structures that once provided belonging, extended families, religious communities, stable neighborhoods, have eroded. Social media provides the illusion of connection without its substance. In this context, alcohol fills a void. It provides an excuse to gather, a reason to reach out, a way to feel less alone, even if only briefly. Until we address the void, we will keep filling it with something. The ancient jar sits in its climate-controlled case in Beijing, just as it has for decades. Museum visitors glance at it, read the placard explaining its significance, and move on. Most linger less than a minute. But think about what this jar represents. 9,000 years ago, someone carefully selected rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and grapes. They mixed these ingredients in specific proportions. They understood that if left alone, something magical would happen. The mixture would transform. It would become something other than the sum of its parts. They could not have known about yeast, about fermentation, about how sugar molecules break down into ethanol and carbon dioxide. They only knew that it worked, that the liquid they produced made people feel different, better, at least for a while. And they decided this was valuable, valuable enough to develop techniques for, valuable enough to pass down to the next generation, valuable enough to integrate into their culture, their celebrations, perhaps their religious ceremonies. That decision to deliberately produce alcohol, to control fermentation, to make it a regular part of human life, set in motion everything that followed. The temples built to brewing goddesses, the symposia where philosophy was born, the taverns where workers gathered after exhausting shifts, the wine that became the blood of Christ and the symbol of the Sabbath, the gin that nearly destroyed London, the prohibition that created organized crime, the marketing that turned drinking into identity, the addiction that destroys lives, and the community that helps people recover. All of it traces back to this jar and thousands of others like it, scattered across continents and millennia. Alcohol is woven into human history so deeply that trying to remove it would be like pulling a thread from a tapestry until the whole thing unravels. It has shaped religion, economics, politics, art, medicine, and social life. It has brought people together and torn them apart. It has inspired poetry and caused violence. It has been sacrament and poison, gift and curse, often simultaneously. We cannot uninvent it, and most people do not want to. Despite everything, despite the addiction, the disease, the accidents, the regrets, alcohol persists because it works. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but often enough to keep billions of people reaching for it. The question each generation must answer is not whether to allow alcohol. It is how to live with it, how to preserve its benefits while minimizing its harms, how to maintain the rituals that contain it while acknowledging that rituals themselves have eroded, how to help the 10% for whom it becomes catastrophic while not punishing the 90% for whom it remains manageable. There are no perfect answers. Every approach involves trade-offs. Individual freedom versus collective welfare, pleasure versus safety, tradition versus progress. But perhaps the first step is simply honesty, acknowledging that alcohol is not just a beverage. It is a social technology, one of the oldest and most powerful we have. It has shaped us as surely as agriculture, writing, or the wheel. And like all powerful technologies, it can be used well or poorly. It can build or destroy. The choice, such as it is, belongs to the individual and the culture they inhabit. The bar is closing. Last call was 30 minutes ago. The bartender wipes down the counter, stacks glasses, and counts the register. A few stragglers finish their drinks and reluctantly pull on coats. Outside, the city is quiet. A couple walks home, arms linked, laughing about something one of them said. They will wake tomorrow with only pleasant memories of the evening. In another neighborhood, someone sits alone in a darkened apartment, staring at an empty bottle. They had promised themselves they would stop. Tomorrow, they tell themselves. Tomorrow they will stop. But tomorrow always becomes today, and the promise evaporates. And in a church basement across town, a meeting is starting. Folding chairs scrape against linoleum. Coffee is poured. Someone begins to speak. My name is... All of this is alcohol. The celebration and the isolation. The connection and the addiction. The ritual and the ruin. It is impossible to separate one from the other. They are the same substance, the same history, the same human impulse to alter consciousness, to seek connection, to feel different than we feel. The jar in Beijing has no opinion about any of this. It simply holds what it has always held. Evidence of human ingenuity, human need, and human folly. A reminder that we have been doing this for a very long time, that we will continue doing it in some form for as long as humans exist. The only question is, how do we do it better? How do we keep the symposium while avoiding the solitary bottle? How do we maintain celebration while preventing catastrophe? How do we honor the ancient need for altered states while protecting the vulnerable? These are not new questions. They are the same questions every culture has faced since the first accidental fermentation, since the first deliberate brew, since someone first decided that the strange liquid that made them feel different was something worth pursuing, worth refining, worth integrating into the fabric of daily life. We have not answered them yet. Perhaps we never will completely. But the jar remains, a silent witness to 9,000 years of human relationship with this strange, powerful, dangerous, beautiful substance we call alcohol. The glass is empty. Whether it will be filled again is a choice each person makes, over and over, every day. If this deep dive into the history of alcohol resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.